Insight is the industry's first embedded security approach for containers. Trusted by Global 1000 enterprises to secure their containerized applications, it's the only solution that requires no root privileges, has zero dependency on the underlying infrastructure, and is fully portable across any container environment. Unified DevOps and SecOps, enabling the rapid development of containerized applications without worrying about security. To learn more, please visit layeredinsight.com/ASW. Innovation's a funny thing, in a cosmic sort of way. While it drives your business forward, it also exposes new risks that can slow you down. As an IT or security professional, every day you need to know, are you vulnerable? Are you compromised? And finally, are you optimized to quickly spot and resolve issues to keep your operation humming? It's your responsibility to help the organization safely and reliably implement the latest connected technologies. So how can you outsmart this little paradox? Rapid7 solutions are powered by advanced analytics and an unmatched understanding of the attacker's mindset. Visit rapid7.com to learn more about how Rapid7 products transform data into action. Signal Sciences is the industry's first web protection platform that works in any cloud, any container, any platform as a service, and any modern application architecture. The Signal Sciences web protection platform can be deployed in next-generation WAF, RASP, or reverse proxy modes, giving customers ultimate flexibility and coverage. Protect your web applications with Signal Sciences web protection platform. Signal Sciences, protecting applications, connecting teams. For more information, check them out at signalsciences.com/PSW.
Hey, welcome back. Just a couple of quick announcements before we jump into that pre-recorded interview with Rami Sass, CEO and co-founder of WhiteSource. First, BugCrowd is hiring. So after closing our Series C funding round at $26 million, we're expanding headcount across the organization. Check out bugcrowd.com/careers or email me hoodie@securityweekly.com if you have any questions about any of those positions, need an introduction, or just want somebody to look at your resume and see where you'd be a good fit. Again, that's hoodie@securityweekly.com. or for the actual listing of those opportunities, bugcrowd.com/careers. Also, Application Security Weekly is changing schedules. We're going to be recording on Mondays from 3:30 to 4:30 Eastern, starting this Monday, April 30th. For those of you listening on the podcast, you'll probably get this a little bit afterwards, so you might have a double header coming up. But otherwise, I hope you enjoy the show and enjoy this interview with Rami Sass.
Welcome back, everyone, to Application Security Weekly. I am, of course, your host, Keith Hoodlet, joined today by none other than Rami Sass, CEO and co-founder of WhiteSource. Rami is an experienced entrepreneur and executive with vast experience in defining innovative products, leading technology groups, and growing companies from seed level to business maturity. Before founding WhiteSource, Rami founded Testology, and before that, led development efforts at both CA and at Equifax, which was later acquired by CA, interestingly enough. Rami, welcome to Application Security Weekly.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Paul, glad to have you, still with us here as well in studio, of course, looking beautiful as always today.
Oh, thank you, Keith.
You're very welcome. Real quick, just to get started, Rami, tell us a little bit about WhiteSource. Who are you guys and what do you do?
So we're a relatively mature startup company that helps software engineering teams keep track of their open source usage and then alert them to known security vulnerabilities in the open source components that they use, help them manage compliance and licensing issues, and many other open source related data that we provide and issues that we help them track and risks that we help them mitigate.
Awesome. Let me also, so I'm going to go back and get a little bit of your history here, but how long has WhiteSource been a company? When were you guys founded?
Almost 7 years ago. It was back in 2011.
Awesome. And there's been quite a lot of change over those 7 years, I'm sure that we'll have fun talking about here. But a little bit about yourself. When did you get started in software development, and when did you kind of find that security was a part of that you wanted to explore further?
Right. So I've been writing code since I was 14. So back in I think it was the 8th grade or something like that, I joined sort of the computer society in my high school and was hooked. And, I was this teenager who started building computers from scratch, buying off little pieces and assembling them myself, and then started to write code on top of that computer and have been coding ever since. My first encounter with the security world was actually at Equifax, where we were developing an innovative system for role management as part of a broader identity management security issue, where I also met my current partners who at the time were leading the company, Ron and Ozzy. They were the founder and CEO there, and sort of opened me up to this very interesting world of cybersecurity.
That's awesome. One question that I do have as a general follow-up, and I want to make sure Paul gets an opportunity to ask some questions as well, but in your opinion, since you've been doing this for quite a while, both from writing software and now obviously in the security space, and have been in the security space for some time, in your opinion, what do you feel has changed the most since you've joined the industry?
Well, practically everything's changed. I don't think anything stayed the same. I think it's a very dynamic and rapidly changing kind of arena where you always have this arms race going on between hackers and attackers and the people who try to stop them and companies who try to come up with solutions. So, any given year on your calendar will bring with it a lot of changes, a lot of new ways, new innovations, both from the attackers who keep thinking up new ways to hack into systems, and on the defense side, coming up with new systems and new methods and practices to try and protect the people and assets from these attacks.
That's awesome. Paul, I don't know if you want to dive deeper on that. I do have a few other questions here as well for Rami.
I had a question based on some recent news and certainly news articles that we've covered in the past where a large company, and I think in the most recent example, it was Linksys maybe, or Belkin, or one of those companies, someone essentially discovered that they were using open source software and hadn't disclosed that. And I know that's one of the things that you can detect in a development environment. What's the risk for a company if they end up using open source software and unbeknownst to them, they're using it and they haven't disclosed that and released their changes out to the public?
Right. So look, today we see two main risks. One, and actually the primary one, is around security vulnerabilities, which doesn't directly relate to disclosure, but it's the bigger risk of the two, where if people take in open source components that have vulnerabilities, especially when these vulnerabilities have been made public by the community in order to try and fix them and in order to try to alert the people using them, then that causes a big risk when you embed these open source components into your systems and then distribute your systems and sell them to your customers. And the second risk goes to what you are referring to, is around licensing, because open source, in order to even be open source, has to come with a license attached to it. And oftentimes this license will also define a few requirements. So it comes free of payment. You'd have to pay for it free of charge, but they do want you to disclose that you're using these components. They sometimes want you to release changes you're making to them, or in some more extreme cases, you even have to disclose your entire code base and make that open source for specific kinds of licenses. So most licenses are not very difficult to comply with, but if you are not paying attention, then you could just by negligence find yourself not complying with the requirements and be in a sort of precarious situation.
I've also found it interesting, and by no means do I expect you to give away your secret sauce, right? But in covering vulnerabilities in the past 13 plus years, open source software that contains vulnerabilities, the way they disclose that seems to be all over the map. Like sometimes you find it in a bug tracker, sometimes there's a public disclosure. The larger ones get a logo and a theme song and a website, and US CERT and other countries' certs are sending out alerts. But then you got all the way down to like, yeah, someone fixed something but never told anyone about it. So how do you track open source vulnerabilities and make sure that you have the best coverage possible?
Right. So you're actually very much correct, and this is a complex problem. There is one kind of a mainstream way to report on open source vulnerabilities, and that's to go through a process defined by Mitre and then report it to NVD, the National Vulnerabilities Database. That's a federally backed institution in the US, and they have all these rules and policy on how to report, and it's the most orderly way to do it, and it gets published and distributed, and that's great. But you're absolutely right that not everyone is doing that process. Sometimes not everyone even knows that this process exists, and many people will simply report vulnerabilities they find in their own open source community, in their own project, maybe on their own bug tracker that could also be public. So we make an effort to, one, cover the NVD as diligently as we can, but also go out to other sources where vulnerabilities are disclosed and sort of curate those as well in order to facilitate the reports that don't end up in NVD and be able to alert on those to our users as well.
Yeah, I always also find it interesting when ever Linus Torvalds talks about security. It just tends to leave you like scratching your head. Like, no, that was a security problem. And Linus is always like, no, it's not a security problem, or to hell with security. So it makes your job very challenging, as not just Linus, but other developers might fix things and go, well, that's not really a security issue. But in actuality, it is, which even further compounds the problem.
Yes, you're right. There is some tension, there's some built-in tension between engineering and security. We see this very often inside commercial organizations. You're right that it also happens outside and in public communities, but if you think about it, inside a company, an organization that develops software and sells some kind of commercial program, either if they are selling software directly or if they are selling something else that's utilizing software, then by definition, the engineers have their own priorities and they need to push out new products, new technologies, develop new features, and security is not top of mind for them. They have their own schedules and milestones they need to adhere to, whereas the security officers have a competing goal where, the most safe software is software that doesn't get released, right? So if they had their way, they would slow you down to a halt and make sure that everything you write is fully secure. So there is some sort of friction going on here between the engineering part of the organization and the security part. And sort of our mission in life is to try and reduce that friction as much as we can and try and help these guys work together in as friendly a way as we can help them work.
And how is generally the reception when a developer is pushing out code and they have a library or some open source component that's vulnerable and they get notified? Have you been able to maintain like a trusted relationship and the developers say, oh yeah, that is a problem, I'll go update it? Is that an easier process than when it's a bug in their own code? And how is that relationship between the security and the developers in the light of your product space?
All right. So look, it's always a challenge to have engineers do that, and they always have to prioritize it against other things they have to do. So we strive and again invest a lot of effort into pushing the discovery of the problems as early in the process as possible. This is part of a broader theme that's known as shift left. Mm-hmm. If you think about the software development lifecycle as an arrow going from left to right, where on the top leftmost side, it starts from the design and planning phase, going through the integration, building, releasing, and maintenance, all the way to the right. Then shifting right means that you try and identify problems as early as possible in that process, ideally in the design or planning phase, but if not, at least at the building and testing phase. And at that point in time, developers still have a relatively easy time fixing issues and replacing open source components, much more so than if you discover issues post-release or even during deployment. It's a bigger hassle at that point.
Yeah, and we've certainly experienced that here. And I think the work involved in swapping out an open source component is usually much less. You might have to modify some of your code to conform with the new version of the library. That's often much less work than fixing something in your own code, but you're certainly right. Earlier in the process is always better.
Right. No, you're absolutely right as well, because upgrading an open source version basically means you are using other people's work. So someone in the open source community has already went through the trouble of fixing the actual issue and testing it and, making sure that it works well, and sort of saved you the trouble of doing that work yourself.
And as a follow-on question to that as well, so Rami, are there any specific examples or situations that folks would know in the news where WhiteSource would have helped a company prevent a breach or other security incident based on that kind of, knowledge of bad library need to go fix sort of situation?
Right. I think you are alluding to the Equifax data breach.
Just maybe. I mean, there's been a number of breaches lately in open source, so
Right.
that happens to be a good one to hit on, though.
Yeah, I think it was very prominently displayed everywhere, basically, and is very well known. Maybe the most well-known breach that's related to open source, and we now know that it was traced back to a known vulnerability in a very popular open source component that I am sure is used extremely widely by, I would dare say, most organizations in the world even. And it sort of blew up in Equifax's face, even though I'm pretty sure they are not special. They are not especially negligent or did something that's horribly wrong by comparison to others, but they did suffer horrible consequences. And also the vulnerability isn't that special. There are many similar vulnerabilities in other open source components, and it's not that difficult to fix. So there were patches available and newer versions available, and you just needed to know about it. You just need to know that you were using a vulnerable components, and then the mitigation was relatively easy.
And so based on seeing that and other vulnerabilities that have come about lately, are there any strong trends as an organization, especially as you're looking into open source libraries and their use more broadly, are there any trends that you're starting to recognize or observe as you grow as a company?
Right. Look, the main trend we're seeing is that more and more companies and more software engineering teams in general become increasingly aware of this issue and become more sensitive to the kinds of open source components that they allow themselves to take on, and become more selective and try to keep track of these components while choosing them and while embedding them into their software. So we see a strong trend today of people starting to take note of what open source they're using, make sure it's high quality, make sure it has good pedigree, and even track it moving forward after they may have made their choice and embed it as part of the software to stay informed of new vulnerabilities as they are being discovered.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
I found it interesting, as a penetration tester. I would love it when I discovered that there was some kind of open source component in the application and it's vulnerable, because I have access now as the attacker to all of those resources. I can go look at that open source code. I can find information about the vulnerability. I can probably find an exploit or two or three, for that particular problem. And because the organization may not know that that component's in there and know that it's vulnerable, it ends up in the application. And I think that's a higher risk oftentimes than a bug in some kind of custom software that they have. I'm sure you share that opinion, but in terms of risk, these tend to be, I think, higher risk for some of those reasons, correct?
Right. So there's kind of a balance of risk here, or different distribution of risk factors between commercial code and open source code, where in commercial code, I think overall there are more vulnerabilities and they get fixed slower than open source communities tend to fix their code. But because they are not publicly known, they are not as exploitable. So while open source vulnerabilities are more scarce, they are much more easy to exploit because they are in the public domain, because you have access to the code, because an attack has already been well documented and you can just copy it. So yeah, I agree.
So with that, just to confirm as well, for WhiteSource, where do you folks fit into the DevOps process? Does it end up being called as like a Jenkins job after the code has been committed to a code repository? Are you somewhere sitting between the commit to the code repository and then actually like having it land in the repository? Where do you folks actually fit in terms of implementation as part of that tool set and that chain of development?
Right. So we actually have a very broad range of different plugins, native plugins to various development environments, including build and CI servers, but also various different repositories and also bug trackers and others. So we try and let our users have as much flexibility as they want in plugging us in. We would normally recommend doing it as early in the process as possible and also in a continuous fashion. Normally, on average, the user would install it on their CI server and have it part of their CI process to get continuous coverage. And that works pretty well. So if it's part of your Jenkins build, then you're in pretty good state.
Awesome. Given that all the trends that you're seeing and the changes that you've experienced over your career in security and in development, what do you think the future looks like in this space, specific to open source software and vulnerabilities as they might be presented in open source software?
All right. So I think it's going to be very interesting. You see a big trend in security to go back, because essentially all security, any cyber kind of security or other, at the end of the day is protecting some piece of software. So I think more and more people will try and go deeper inside this sort of outer layer and try and reach the actual software that's being protected and make sure that it is developed in a more secure fashion. And to do that, I think more and more people will need to start using tools that will help them achieve that goal and cover both potential security issues with the proprietary code as well as known vulnerabilities in the open source part. And I think a big part of what we will see coming in the future are more ways to help you prioritize which vulnerabilities you need to fix first, because even essentially any kind of security scanning solution, doesn't matter what kind, will give you a report of many different potential vulnerabilities, and usually it will be more than you can handle, or practically always it will be more than anyone could reasonably be expected to handle. And I think a big part of improving the security of your application will eventually revolve around the ability to prioritize these issues and make sure that you are mitigating the ones that are more severe on the one hand, but also the ones that really have an impact on you and your software and are not just lying in some piece of dead code. It could be a real vulnerability, but it never actually gets called from your application, so it doesn't really affect you.
So I do have 5 final questions, but before we do that, Paul, do you have any follow-up questions that you'd like to ask?
Rami, if people are interested in checking out your software solutions, is there a demo or a free trial, or can they schedule some time with someone to get a demo? Like, how does it work? If people are listening to this and they're like, "Well, I'm really interested. I want to know more," what should they do next?
Sure, you can just go on our website and leave your information, and we'll get back to you to schedule either a demo or an evaluation, whatever. We do that all the time.
That's awesome. And I do want to say that I've spoken to some of your customers by just sheer luck. I happened to run into one of my friends that works for a company, and they said, well, we picked up this solution. And I'm like, how do you like it? And he had nothing but good things to say. He said it was awesome. So you passed the evaluation test. When we talked to our friends in the community, he was very happy with your solution. So that was good to hear.
I like your friend already.
Yeah.
So, Rami, are you ready for Application Security Weekly's 5 questions?
Shoot.
All right. So what were the specs like on your first computer?
It was a 386 uh, with a few megs of RAM, a few 8 megs of RAM, and probably not much more than that of a hard disk. And it had 2 floppy disk drives.
Really?
Wow,
If you
you were
believe that.
having
Yeah.
two. You were the cool kid on the block if you had two.
Yeah, because some of the games or the applications you ran, you had to switch disks, and
Yes,
Yep.
right,
I
you
remember
couldn't
that.
do that with just one drive.
That's awesome. No, that is, man, that brings me way back.
Mm.
So
Right.
then from there, Rami, what programming language did you learn first? And if you write any code today, what do you enjoy writing in today?
So I think the first one was Pascal,
Mhm.
which, in all honesty, I didn't really like that much. My favorite is Java, and I've done most of my professional career writing Java, and I love it. It's awesome.
It's on 3 billion devices worldwide, or so I hear. So, so you definitely a
Right.
lucrative market for Java development. So here's a controversial question for you, Rami: Vim or Emacs, or in this case, maybe Eclipse?
Yeah. Look, in all honesty, I don't really care. I only had to do either during my university studies, and never looked back. I didn't use them before. I didn't use them after. I didn't find that to be a great experience, and I don't care. Sorry.
No, no apology necessary. You know what? I definitely would want to stay out of that holy war, as it were, for developers. So that by all means, I wouldn't want to get in the middle of that either. So then let me ask, and it sounds like this Java might be the case as well here, but for people that are starting to learn programming today, what language or languages would you recommend that they pick up?
So look, I think Java is a pretty safe choice, and I don't see it going anywhere. But if you really want to sort of hope on a big trend that's going on now, I think NPM is very hot right now, and for good reasons. It's very interesting and has a lot of potential. And I think even though it's been growing like crazy, we will still see growth in that area over the next few years. And if, depending on exactly what you're trying to do or what your favorite kinds of tasks are, maybe also Python
Yeah,
is
Python is the
nice.
big one as well. Yeah, Paul and I both develop in Python. I've learned a bit of JavaScript myself and worked with some of the different, libraries, frameworks, languages that are around that world. And it's definitely growing faster than I think anyone can realistically keep up with.
Right.
Final question for you, Rami. Who would you nominate, or what topics would you nominate that we cover on a future episode of Application Security Weekly?
Yeah, I'm going to be a little obvious here, but I think AI is becoming more and more interesting, especially around security and what security companies can and should be doing with it. And that's one. And also, not very creative one, but something that I think it deserves more attention is women in security and women in the software engineering industry in general is also something that deserves, I think, more media coverage.
Absolutely, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that. Especially, I was really excited to see, just kind of off the cuff, Parisa Tabriz from Google is going to be giving the keynote at Black Hat this year. So I was really excited to see that as well. And yeah, there are a number of people, especially like Jesse Frizzell from now, I believe, Microsoft, from the Docker community that I've wanted to get on the show as well. So hopefully we can start to get some of them involved in Application Security Weekly.
Well, yeah, and my advice on that topic, just to kind of chime in too, is, I signed my son up for a programming class, and it was all boys in the class. And kind of my public service announcement is, if you have children, regardless of gender, encourage them to get into software engineering, because I think it's really important to start that at a very young age. I think my son was 7, and when I was the same age that I started programming was at 7. So when they get to that age, I strongly encourage, regardless of gender, to get them involved in the field.
All right. So
And
my daughter is 6, and I'm trying to get her started now.
There you go. Good job.
I've heard
All
that the
right.
Minecraft community is a really great way to
Sure.
get kids involved, because it's Python coding,
Yeah.
and kids of all ages, genders, and interest levels seem to really love that game. So I think that there's some hope for getting that to be more of a thing going forward, which is awesome.
I'll get one for my daughter.
There you go. Yeah, Minecraft. Go ahead and grab it online. It's a lot of fun, and I think Larry's kids also play on that as well. So we talk about that quite a lot here on the Security Weekly Network. With that, Rami, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everyone for joining us this week for another episode of Application Security Weekly. Remember to git commit and stay classy.